Hey everybody, welcome to Fish Tales. My name is Mark Wakeham-Stevick, and we're here at the Gloucester Stage Company. It's pretty empty right now. We hope to be full soon. Tonight's Fish Tales theme is Turning Point. It's a really great theme for any storyteller. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. First, I want to say some thank yous to some of the Gloucester Stage folks. Chris Griffith, thank you. Bob Walsh, and of course everybody at Gloucester Stage Company. To the Gloucester Writers Center and Henry Farini. I've just joined the board of directors there. Great honor for me. And of course, Fish Tales founder Maureen Aylward, and we're all rooting for her. And all the people who generously support the Gloucester Writers Center and the Gloucester Stage Company. Turning Point is a theme that pretty much tells you how to do a story well, right? If a story has a turning point, we're into it. If it doesn't, if it's status quo, everything's the same to the end, I'm yawning. It's time for a new story. We want a story where at the end you can say, and nothing was ever the same afterward. That's the kind of story we have for you tonight. These stories all have a turning point. So here's our call for stories. Give us stories about your turning points, a time when you turned back, turned around, turned away, turned into, tuned into, retuned the strings, returned the ring, returned to the village changed, wiser after slaying the dragon, after turning to face the dragon that was you. And the day turned over, and the tide turned at last, and you turned your face toward home, toward the east, toward eternity, right there at the turning point. You could do that same thing with the word point of attack, point to hawk, but we're not going to do that. Although point of attack is actually a good storytelling concept, how do you launch the story that something fantastic or strange happened to you? What's the point of attack? You'll enjoy the point of attack from these storytellers tonight. Right now, I'd like to turn this over to our storyteller in residence, Casey Breton. Casey.
Of all the things that I was nervous about when I was asked to be the storyteller in residence for this year, being the storyteller in residence during a pandemic was not one of them. But alas, here we are. It's been a great year in some ways, a crazy year in other ways, but I've loved being the storyteller in residence through it all, and so glad we could continue virtually. I'm very, very, very excited and happy and thrilled for Layla to be the new storyteller in residence, and thrilled to be passing the fishhook on to her.
I'm a biology teacher. The last thing I thought I would ever get to put on my resume is storyteller in residence, and that's basically why I said yes. But really, stories are how we teach lessons. Stories are how we make meaning of our lives. Stories are how we pass on our truths, and there's never been a time when that felt more important than now. So thank you for this opportunity, and I'm really excited.
Welcome our new storyteller in residence, Layla Goodman. This is the poetry slam way of clapping. And Layla, we'll be hearing a story from her just a little bit later. First, we have a story from Matt Conti. Let me introduce him to you. He's a 13-year teaching veteran of Gann Academy, an independent Jewish day school in the Boston area. Matt's an avid reader, stays active with yoga, spinning, and jumping rope. He lives in JP with his wife and 2 children, ages 6 and 3. Here's Matt.
I'm not ready for this. My 2-year-old is screaming at me. We're crossing a busy Boston street, and he yells, "No, Dad," and wiggles his hand free from my own. I panic at the idea of him running into an intersection, so I quickly scoop him up, throw him over my shoulder, walk him across the street, and place him down on the sidewalk. He, of course, revolts by sitting down, taking off both shoes, and putting his thumb in his mouth. I grew up in a household with a lot of rules. Though both of my parents rejected their Jewish and Catholic upbringing, the idea that rules were essential to leading a good life stayed with them. It seemed like everything in my house had its own set of rules. There was a specific way to set the table: salad fork, dinner fork, plate, knife with the shiny side pointing in, and a spoon. There was a separate way of setting up the sound system, whether you were listening to music or watching a movie. Even the linen closet had its own set of rules, towels folded one way, sheets folded another way, and placed in a very specific order on a very specific shelf. As a kid, I actually wasn't really bothered by all these rules. It was helpful to leading a good life. I followed the rules and everyone was happy. As I grew up, I got to make some of my own rules and my family followed them too. So when I found out I was going to be a father, I was really excited to find there were so many books about parenting. I scanned through reading this set of rules and that set of rules, making mental notes. For surely, if this set of rules didn't work, well, I had a few others to go to. For any of you who are parents know, this was quickly dissolved once I actually became a father. The first night in the hospital, I was trying to let my wife get some very essential sleep after a day and a half of labor and pushing all night. So I let her go to bed, and I took on the responsibility of getting Adine, my new son, to go to sleep. Well, he didn't want to go to sleep, so I paced the hospital room, and he started to calm down a little bit. Figuring I should just keep this going, I walked out of the door into the hallway. No sooner had I done this than one of the nursing staff came over to me, telling me that this was against the rules, and I had to go back to the room. I tried to get Adine down, but no luck. His cries woke up my wife, who nursed him back into bliss. When I got home, things didn't improve much. While it became clear I was ready for all the technical challenges of being a father, setting up a crib, putting the car seat in, all of those things I could handle, swaddles, diapers. But when it came to meeting the emotional needs of my child, I was not ready. I was not prepared to look into his crying and screaming face and realize that there was nothing I could do for him in that moment. While at my job, I was able to dive into a well of patience for my colleagues and the myriad of teenagers I would teach every day, when I got home, my patience wasn't there for whatever mood Adine would have me in. When he started throwing things at my head, also, the patience wasn't there. Okay, he's young, I told myself. Surely as he gets older, I will be ready for this. Well, with each new milestone came new challenges. It was impossible to be ready for Adine because Adine was different every day. One moment he'd be running around, jumping off of furniture and swings. The next moment he would burst into tears after I gave him the thing that he asked me for. I didn't give up. I kept reading books. I started a meditation practice. I kept going to my yoga mat and running. I even ran a half marathon and went into therapy. Alas, all of this did not make me the father that I hoped and imagined I would be. The well of serenity and peace just wasn't there. And then I became enlightened. One morning, having coffee with a dear friend who, in addition to being wise and the successful parent of 2 adult children, also happened to be Adine's doula, I confessed to her that I really was not a very good parent and I was never ready for what my child would throw at me. She sort of sighed, said, "Oh, you'll never be ready," and got up and grabbed a note from a drawer. She said, "Don't worry about being ready. Being a parent is just about showing up, being prepared to be unprepared." She handed me the note and said, "Put this in a place where you'll see it often." So a few days later, I'm showing up for Adine as he's on that sidewalk, shoes off, legs splayed, thumb in mouth, angrily staring up at me while people pass by. I try and convince him to put his shoes on, no luck. I said, "Okay, Adine, can we just go to the car?" He stands up and walks barefooted next to me. I have his shoes in my hand, and finally, we make it to the car. I belt him in and take my place in the seat. Taped to the steering wheel in front of me is the note that I was handed a few days earlier. It reads, "I am obviously completely incompetent and completely inadequate to handle the challenges which reality places before me. However, fortunately or unfortunately, I happen to be the best person available." Adine, from the seat behind me, impatiently shouts, "Abba, let's go. Aren't you ready?"
Thanks, Matt. Great story. If you're a parent, you recognize the turning point in that, I think, and maybe if you're a child, you recognize it too. I wish I were here in the audience with all of you, giving feedback to Matt. That's one of the things I love about storytelling. Really good storytellers have that back and forth with an audience. Our next storyteller is great at such things too. It's Layla Goodman. She's a nonlinear biology teacher who's been celebrating awe and wonder with adolescence for 36, count them, years. She's the spirit watcher at Gann Academy, and she and her husband, Barry Moir, have 2 adult children, 1 delightful grandson, and 1 dog who keeps them walking. Here is Layla.
There's a line in a folk song by David Wilcox that I've always loved. It goes, "There's a hole in the middle of the prettiest life, so the lawyers and the prophets say, not your father, nor your mother, nor your daughter, nor your lover ever made it go away." In 1998, after a decade of marriage, my husband and I were going to get a night alone without our kids, then aged 8 and 6. 3 nights, actually. We were all going to fly to Hollywood, Florida, where I grew up, spend a week with my family, and then leave the kids for 3 nights with my mom while Barry and I came home to Gloucester in our empty house. I was so excited. I was imagining romantic dinners without any spills, sleeping late, watching R-rated movies during the day. The week was the usual series of traumatic events common to family vacations. In my family, everyone yells louder and louder, wanting to be heard, and no one listens. I found my mom vacuuming at 3 a.m, and one night at dinner, literally in the middle of eating, she got up and started washing the dishes. It is reasonable to expect that at any of these moments, it might have occurred to me that this plan was probably not ideal for either my children or my mother. But all I could think about was my romantic reboot. On the day Barry and I were to leave, I came downstairs to find my mom frantically reading the weather page in the newspaper. "There might be a snowstorm in Boston," she said. What if you and Barry can't get to the airport?" What, Mom? I tried to be calm. What's the worst that can happen? You'll get my kids for an extra day or 2. But all she could imagine was an avalanche covering our house, snowing Barry and I in until spring. Just at that moment, my daughter walked through carrying a glass of water, just water, no ice, just water, and she sat down in the white upholstered dining room chair. My mom shrieked, No food or drink in that area!" That voice, I knew that voice. That was the voice that taught me as a child that maintaining order and keeping things clean was more important than our relationship. I yelled, "Why the fuck do you have white cloth dining room chairs? Who would ever want a white cloth dining room chair?" My mom ran out of the house crying, and I followed a few minutes later. I found her sitting on a bench in the garden sobbing. I hadn't seen her sob like that since my parents got divorced when I was 13. Watching her cry, I realized my mom had her own hole, a place where she didn't feel loved, seen, or valued, and that my words and my criticisms pushed on that source of pain and caused more harm. Her obsessive vacuuming, her emptying the bathroom trash with one tissue in it, her need for pristine white chairs was all part of a veneer to cover the hole in her pretty life. I said I was sorry. I went back in the house. I called the airline, changed the kids' flights, packed their bags, and we went to the airport. As we walked through the terminal, I felt a deep sadness. Yeah, a 3-night date night would have been great. But what I really yearned for, what I really wanted, was for my mom to take as much delight in my kids as I took in my kids, spills and all. The next morning, my kids woke up early, and I walked into the kitchen to find them smushing Play-Doh into the floor and shrieking with joy. At that moment, I let go of the illusion that my mom could ever be present with me or my kids. Thank you.
Thanks, Layla. Layla's so good at the balance between improv and practice. You can tell she's done lots of these, and that's why she's our new storyteller in residence. that balance is one of the things I just love. And I suffer from stage fright when I get up in her situation and tell a story. So I have to memorize everything really carefully. And actually that can make it a little dry. I don't react as well with the audience. So one time I decided I'll do it improv. I'll just learn the elements of the story and tell it. And it was going great. And then my mouth went dry partway through. And I couldn't speak. My tongue was like that against the roof of my mouth. And I had to say, my mouth's dry. And someone in the front row handed me a glass of water. And I gulped it down and finished my story. And it went okay after I got off stage. I was feeling kind of shamed, but as folks were leaving, someone said, "That was awesome. You're a really good storyteller." And I won second place in that particular event. Our next storyteller hopefully won't get dry mouth like that. She's Pina Madeira. She grew up around people telling stories or writing stories, and she in fact went on to earn a BA in fiction writing. She spun bedtime stories for her own sons, featuring these characters: Frinkle the ineffective witch, Jetpack Chicken, and Burl the squirrel. She's also a mom, wife, teacher, dog owner, and a musician. Please enjoy Piña.
My story is about a sunny November day outside of Boston, and the year is 2016. And on this day, I learned that the skills that I'd honed and the things that I'd learned about taking care of young children when my children were toddlers 10 years previous to this sunny day were going to be slightly different than the skills I was going to need to take care of my aging parents. And I was going to need to know the skills that I needed for my aging parents because we had recently invited them to move in with us. Their failing health required that they get more care, and I was going to be their primary caregiver. So this story sounds like it might be kind of sad, but in reality, this was a really amazing time in my family. It included a lot of poker playing late into the night. It included storytelling, stories about my father's childhood in the Deep South in the 30s and my mother's childhood in Mexico. There was inappropriate joke telling constantly from my father, and there was endless supplies of mint chocolate chip ice cream in the freezer. Each of my parents arrived at this stage of life very differently. My mother had had sort of a slow and steady decline in her health, suffering from osteoporosis, from arthritis, from scoliosis. And by the time she moved in with us that year, her body was twisted and she was in lots of pain, and she only weighed 68 pounds. We're small people, but 68 pounds. She was tiny. She was walking with a walker. My father arrived a little bit more suddenly. He had been a very robust and strong and healthy man for much of his life. And one day, he had to have emergency brain surgery to remove a tumor that they had found. And so that brought to the end a career as a middle school substitute teacher. Well, I'll let that sink in for a minute. He was 84, and he chose to be a middle school substitute teacher. My parents were amazing people. But that November day probably felt 2 or 3 weeks after my dad had this emergency surgery. And two important things were going to happen on that day. One was we were going to go and meet with the oncologist and find out what his prognosis was. Big day, important day. The second thing that we were going to do is we were going to take my mom, my reluctant mom, my resistant mom, to a Tai Chi class at the senior center. And one event was a little more important than the other, but in my infinite wisdom, I had decided that my mother, who was frail and weak, needed to get some exercise, needed to build community, and needed to get out of our house. She didn't think that was really what she needed to do today, and she resisted, and she dragged her feet, and she was not happy. But I persisted, and it was kind of like I used my skills that I use with my young children. Like, this is not what she wants to do, but it's good for her. It's like dropping a child off at daycare who doesn't want to go. And so I forced her to go, and off we went. My dad in his wheelchair, with his staples still in his head, lucid and funny and upbeat, and my mother trundling behind in her walker. We got to the senior center, and I learned two things when we got there. One was that, yes, she was registered because I had prepared. I had been, this was the job that I was taking on. She was registered, but she couldn't stay. That was the second thing we learned. She couldn't stay unless a caregiver stayed with her for the entire class. And clearly that wasn't going to happen today because we needed to be at the hospital in just a few minutes, and it was time for us to get going. So we headed back to the car, my mother trundling behind me on her walker, and we got in the car, and 10 minutes later we pulled into the hospital. When we got to the hospital, she declared in no uncertain terms that she was not going in, she was tired, she'd had a rough morning, and she was done. And I thought, okay, can I even do that? Like, can you leave a granny in the car? Like, you can't leave a toddler in the car. You can't leave a dog with the windows cracked. Can you leave a granny whose hands are too weak to undo her seatbelt or to open the car door? Like, can I even leave her in the car? But time was ticking, and this oncology appointment was important. And so I said, Mom, here's your cell phone. Hold it dearly. Like, we'll check in on you. We're going to crack the windows, and we'll see you. I'll be back in a bit. We're not far away. We went in for the meeting, and it went really well. The oncologist was amazing. He connected with my dad in this really real way, and they talked about his options. They had a great talk, and when we left, we really felt we'd been taken care of. Like, it was a lovely meeting. Circumstances were sad, but it was a lovely meeting. And as we're pulling out, as I'm pushing through the door of the down the hallway, my dad says, "Hey, let's call Mom and see how she's doing." So I dial, and the phone rings, and it rings. And it rings, and it rings, and it goes to voicemail. And I instinctively pick up the pace. I'm like, okay, we got to get out there. Neither of us are speaking, but we both know this is not good. We're both anxious. And as we get out of the hospital and the electric doors open, the public address system goes off in the hospital, and it says, meh, meh, meh. Code gray, hospital parking lot. Code gray, hospital parking lot. What is code gray? What is code gray? Code gray only meant one thing in that moment, and it clearly meant little old lady down in the hospital. There was no question. So we looked at each other. My dad looked at me, I looked at him. He pointed to the hospital, to the parking lot, and he said, "Go!" And I locked him into his wheels, locked his wheels, and I left him sitting in the lobby, and I booked it out to the car. I expected there'd be a helicopter circling the car. There'd be a SWAT team. There'd be the jaws of life tearing open to let my mother out. But when I got there, my mother was sitting in the sun. The door of the car was wide open, and she was just basking in the warmth of that November sun, kicking her feet outside the car. And I came up running, "Mom, you didn't answer the phone." She said, "I fell between the seats. I am so sorry. I heard it ring, but I couldn't get it." I was like, "You're okay?" She said, "I'm fine." I said, "How did you get the car door open?" She said, "I put my fingers on the car, in the gap in the window, and I pulled myself up and I shouted to somebody walking by, and they let me out." And I said, "Oh, thank goodness." And then I thought, wow, what must that rescuer have thought of me who had locked her into that car on that sunny day? She said that it had gotten too hot. So as I walked back up to go retrieve my dad from the lobby, I thought I'd learned 3 things this day. I'd learned, 1, that you can't, as hard as you prepare, and you think you can prepare for things, you can't prepare for everything. The second thing I learned is that code gray does not mean little old lady down. And the third thing I learned is that as hard as you think, as much as you think that there's going to be a parallel between taking care of young children and aging parents, there are subtle and important differences, and sometimes you just need to listen to your mother.
Thanks, Piña. Great job. Adam Gopnik has written somewhere that there are the 3 C's of storytelling are comedy, confession, and connection. And obviously we've been checking in with some comedy and some connection, therefore, and some confession too. This next storyteller is really going to lean into the second of those 2, and I think the vulnerability that she brings is one of the things that makes for connection for us. Her name is Sofia Wollheim Martinez, and she recently began writing and performing spoken word poetry. She's 16 years old, and she attends Gann Academy. The poem she's sharing tonight was inspired by her struggle with mental illness. Sofia.
Things change and change and change and change. I knew that. I was not scared that things would always be how they were. I was scared that they wouldn't. I was once so alive, not afraid to strive for what I wanted, not afraid to let myself want something, but I was afraid. of things like fast cars and walking alone at night and standing on top of tall buildings and getting burned. All the things you should be afraid of when you are alive. Eventually, I stopped caring and started treating life like a leather jacket, expensive, but easily replaced. Looking back, I can mark many moments that took me to today. I'm not surprised that it was not foreseen. After all the long nights I spent locking away the loneliness convinced everyone, including me, that lovely was the only thing I could be, and lovely I was. So lovely, I let myself be limited, let myself be told what I could and could not do, who I could and could not be. I gave up my power because after years of being only lovely, I did not know how not to. And for the first time, I was angry. I used to say that sadness seemed too simple. I understood disappointed, distressed, despairing, down in the dumps, but I did not understand sad. I did not understand sad until I did. And I suppose those moments were the beginning of the rest of my life. So as to not take up any space, I started by silently crying. I did not say anything because lovely girls are small. I took refuge in bathroom stalls. I lived in late nights when no one else was awake. By the time they opened their eyes, mine were already dried, and I was already painting a picture of that perfect person they wanted to see. It was utterly exhausting, and I was about to break. I could not take the pressure of the performance much longer, and then the world went quiet. Among all of the lives the pandemic stole, mine was saved. And here the lines get blurry. I do not remember it all that well, but I do know I got worse slowly. Here's what I do remember. 1, after months of denial, I admitted I had a problem. 2, I made a list of things I loved, things like highlighters, hotels, and hot glue. This list kept me going for a while. 3, I took walks every day. The first walk I took made me feel invincible, like nothing could ever hurt me, like not even I could hurt me. My walks made everything feel lovely again until they didn't. The last walk I took is very fuzzy. I remember walking alone in the middle of the road. I remember crying out for help because the world looked too bright, and I remember sending my location to my mother because although my walk had started during the day, it was dark and I had no idea where I was. I do not go on walks anymore. 4, I stopped talking to the people I used to love. 5, I forced myself to spend all of my time in bed because my bed held me accountable. My bed did not want bloodstains. One day, I got out of bed, and today, I'm still paying for that. The first day of school came at the end of August, so it was very hot outside, so every 6 seconds I had to check to make sure my shorts didn't ride up my thigh just a little too high. After all, I had to keep up the lie that I was still lovely. I became a Lexapro lunatic. The SSRIs made me want to die even more than before. A requirement of being lovely was being loved by everyone around me, so I had to be the perfect student, of course. The first week I did not hand in my homework was when I realized I would never be able to get out of the prison that is my head. I did not hand in my homework because homework does not matter when you're dead. I'd rather not get into the details of what came next. But I will say the day I left the hospital, the outside air smelled like how it feels to believe that everything is going to be okay. There was a long time where I would have rathered I die than get better. I still want to die, but now there are a lot more days than there used to be where I want to not want to die. I used to be afraid of things like fast cars and walking alone at night and standing on top of tall buildings and getting burned. A lot of shit has happened since the hospital, including, but not limited to, going into psychosis and thinking my mother was possessed by a demon. That night, huddling in the corner of my locked bathroom, trying to protect myself from the monsters outside, I could not help thinking how nice it was to be scared again.
Thanks so much, Sofia. Really, really great. There it is, connection. That story certainly connects with me. One of the things that helps with connection, confession, and also truth, right? Truth-telling. These are true tales told live. And the truth part's really important there. If you find out that a story is actually not true, you feel a little bit betrayed. Example of that for me is a friend of mine and I driving down through Manchester. We went down a road that was residents only. Wanted to see some big wealthy houses. Came to a dead end. Here's an owner of an estate raking leaves, not happy to see me in my old VW Rabbit pulling up. He came over. I wound down my window this way. That is how old the car was. And I said, we are looking for Masconomo Point, because that was nearby. And he was, he said, I can help you. It's just go down an old corner inn, take a right, left, you're there. Where are you from? And I said, I didn't really want to lie into his face. So I said, I'm from Pennsylvania recently. And he said, oh yeah, but before that. and I said, and suddenly my friend said, he's not really using his own accent. He's an actor. As this guy's face is right in mine, and he went from a smiling face to not such a smiling face. We drove away hastily. Someone who's really good with truth and wouldn't be caught in that way is Casey Breton. We know her as an underpaid juggler. She juggles writing, homeschooling, and her 3 kids, working at Common Crow 2 and maintaining the illusion of order in the home, if that's possible. She says not always. Her first published book for children is called Going Rogue at Hebrew School. Here's Casey Breton.
I have been running late ever since the day I was born. According to my mom, I arrived 4 days after I was due. And I guess you could say it's kind of been that way ever since. Meetings, doctor's appointments, places the kids are supposed to be, places I'm supposed to be, like work, for example. Chances are that I will be running late. And by chances, I mean 100% of the time. And so it was that fateful day in 5th grade when I was running late for school. We had a live-in nanny those days, a woman named Yolanda, who I loved with all my heart. She was short and had brown freckles and black hair. She had piles of clothes in her closet that I loved to play in. We ironed laundry together. Yolanda bought tins of Danish cookies and squares of cornbread, thin cornbread topped with sesame seeds, that I thought were the most delicious things I'd ever tasted. Together, we watched a show called El Chapulín on Spanish TV. Yolanda drove a brown Ford Escort, which she used to get me to school every morning. Let's say it was a warm, sunny morning that day in 5th grade, because it was Los Angeles, and I think all of the mornings were warm and sunny. I was running late, probably rebraiding my hair for the 100th time. Yolanda was busy doing something. I realized if we didn't get going soon, I was going to get another unexcused tardy from school. And I was a good girl. So I really, really didn't want another unexcused tardy from school. I mean, an unexcused tardy? That would be unexcusable. I called out, time to go, and she said she'd be there in a minute. I waited by the front door. Yolanda's minute was taking longer than a minute. Maybe she suffered from the same problem that I did of not being able to keep track of time. Anyway, as I waited, a brilliant idea sprung to mind. An idea that would save me yet another unexcused tardy from school. An idea that would surely be helpful to Yolanda. I found the keys to her car in her purse. I grabbed my backpack and headed out to the brown Ford Escort. See, if I could get the car all ready to go, we would get to school faster. So I walked out, opened the passenger side door so that I'd be able to hop in right when the time came. I went around to the driver's side door, sat inside, put the key in the ignition, and turned it. Just think of how much time this was saving, getting the car all ready like this. Obviously, if I was going to get the car completely ready, I'd have to put it in reverse so that we could just back out of the driveway all lickety-split when the time came. So that's what I did. Press the gear shifter button in, pull the stick to the R, just like I'd seen Yolanda do every morning. All she would have to do is press on the gas pedal and we'd be on our way. I knew all about cars. That brown Ford Escort purred like a kitten. So I was really surprised when the car started rolling backwards down the slope of the driveway. Shocked, in fact. I guess you could say I began to panic. I called out for Yolanda, but she was still inside, taking a minute. The car started to move with greater speed. I yelled louder. Our neighbor from across the street came outside from her house. Now, we didn't have smartphones back then, but if we did, this would be the point she hit the record button. The car is moving faster and faster. I don't know if it was someone telling me to jump out of the car or if it was the voice inside my head. Nevertheless, that is what I did. I leaped from the moving car and hit the sidewalk with a terrified thud. I remember my knees bleeding. By this point, Yolanda had come outside. I don't remember the expression on her face when she realized what I had done, probably because I was too busy crying. But I do remember her running alongside with the car, almost like a dog trainer at a dog show, except that it was a car. I remember her crying out, "Aye, aye, aye," every time the door slammed into her body. And I remember the passenger side door, which I had so cleverly opened to save time, also swinging. I remember the car rolling in circles, down our driveway, to the right, into the street, back up the curb, and across our yard, over and over in circles. The steering wheel must have been turned at an angle. That's why the car was going in circles. Something about a turning point? Anyway, that's my connection to the theme. The neighbor was still outside of her house watching all of this unfold. If only she'd have had a smartphone. I don't remember how many times the car rolled in circles around our yard, but I do remember that it finally stopped when it hit a lamppost in front of our house. I remember my mom being called from work and her coming home in her dental assistant's uniform. And I remember the question she asked me over and over again. What possessed you to do this? She must have taken pity on me, crying and bleeding as I was, because sometimes she would say, "I'm not mad at you. I just need to know what possessed you to do this." I remember my sister, who was at the big middle school at the time, busting a gut laughing when she heard the story later that day and how disappointed she was to have missed the excitement. I remember Yolanda driving me to school that morning, and I remember that her car doors were dented. I remember feeling like a hero when I showed up late to school that morning, because this time my tardiness was excused. Thank you. Thank you for sticking with us through this crazy time, and I hope to see you in the theater soon.
Really great. So funny. I wish there were an audience here. Lots of laughter in that case. But one of the benefits of not having an audience here is no one's going to interrupt your story. No light is going to fall, or Henry's not going to suddenly start sneezing or anything. Right at the climax, that's terrible. That happened once in a play here, probably more than once. Once the lights went out at Gloucester Stage, everybody had to go outside. They set up and finished the play in the parking lot. Kind of a good theater story, but hard on the through line. Sometimes I've got a partner who occasionally ruins my stories by falling asleep at the climax, and I finish and there's a silence, and then she wakes up and says, "Oh, I think I missed some of that." You won't fall asleep for this last story. This is a beautiful one told by Jethro Berkman. He's a rabbi, teacher, and a dad living in Newton with his wife and 3 boys aged 15, 12, and 7, and 2 dogs too. He loves running, playing guitar, listening to every kind of music. Here's Jethro Berkman.
I want to share a story that happened to me about 15 years ago when I was in rabbinical school in Philadelphia. It was a spiritual experience that had a big impact on my life. I'm a rabbi now, and it was a difficult time in my life for a couple of reasons. First of all, my father was suffering from early onset Alzheimer's that had started when he was in his early 50s. It was very painful for me. And at the same time, I was having a kind of crisis of faith. I was reading a lot of philosophy and trying to rationally prove to myself God's existence and not really getting anywhere. So at this point, I was also volunteering for an amazing nonprofit organization called Siloam. It was run by Catholics, a nun named Bernadette and a former priest named Jim. And this nonprofit offered spiritual care for people suffering from HIV or AIDS. People could go to the Siloam office in Philadelphia and receive massage or energy treatment or meditation or yoga for free. So I was volunteering there once or twice a week, amazing organization. And Bernadette came up to me and she said, "Jethro, in a few weeks we're having a retreat for caregivers, for people who are caring for those with the virus, and we'd like you to come." I was nervous. I wasn't sure what I would have to offer these caregivers, but it sounded like an interesting opportunity, so I agreed to come. So a few weeks pass. I drive out to this beautiful convent. It's about an hour outside of Philadelphia for the retreat, and I meet the caregivers. It was a small group, only 6 or 7 of them, some social workers. There was a woman who often traveled to Africa to care for people with AIDS. There was a man whose partner was deaf and mute and living with AIDS. All these people working so hard as caregivers. So the retreat goes on. I'm doing my best to help out. And then Bernadette comes up to me and she says, "Jethro, we're having a program tonight, and I would like you to be the speaker. I want you to share a little bit of yourself, of your story with the group. We always do this at these retreats, and it always ends up being a powerful experience." So I said, "Okay, I'll do it." But again, I was nervous. I wasn't sure what I had to offer these amazing caregivers. And I said, "Bernadette, I'm nervous. I don't really know what I'm going to say." And she said, "Just speak from your heart." So a few hours pass, and it's time for the program. It's in a big room in the convent. It's dark. It's now nighttime. We're sitting in a circle, 10 or 12 of us. Candles are in the middle, and I begin to speak. And I started by speaking about my work with Israeli and Palestinian teenagers at a camp for conflict resolution, which was a powerful experience for me. That was my plan, and I spoke about that, but somehow, without intending to, I ended up speaking about my father. And I shared with the group something that had happened just a couple weeks before at our family Passover Seder at my parents' house, where my dad had tried to read a poem. He loved poetry and would often read a poem at family meals. And in front of all the guests, he tried to read this poem, and he couldn't get through it because of his Alzheimer's. He was stumbling over the words, losing his place. A very painful experience. So as I shared this with the group, I started to cry. And the woman next to me, one of the social workers, one of the caregivers, put her hand on my back and said, "It's okay, let it go." And I started to cry more. And as I started to cry even more, I started to share more about my father and his illness and our relationship and his life. And it just all came pouring out of me, and I felt like I was just rinsing out kind of years of pain that had built up. Eventually, I stopped speaking, and the people in the group started speaking to me. And I remember one of the social workers said, "Jethro, your father loves you, and he is so proud of you. You have to know this." And it just was exactly what I needed to hear. And I remember thinking, how did she know that that's exactly what I needed to hear? And Jim, the former priest, said, "Jethro, your father's life has been a success, and the best parts of him are living on in you." And again, it was just exactly what I needed to hear. It was like a puzzle piece that fit exactly into the hole in my heart that needed to be filled. And other people in the group continued to speak these beautiful things that were so healing for me. And as finally my crying quieted and people finished speaking, and it just felt like everything that's always in between and in the way, kind of clogging the space between people, worries, insecurities, had just been cleared away. And it felt like there was holiness hanging in the air. And as I looked up and I saw their faces in the candlelight, I remember thinking, I was so nervous about helping these people. How am I going to help them? And then they ended up helping me, giving me one of the biggest gifts I've received in my life. And all of those worries about philosophy and God and how can I prove God's existence suddenly seemed so small, because I felt like God was there in the room with us, in the space between us.
That was Jethro Berkman. Thank you so much, Jethro. Thanks to everyone, all of you, for attending this in the way that you have. We want to thank again Gloucester Stage Company, Gloucester Writers Center. This is now the tail end of the Fish Tales. The next one is in May. The theme will be joy. We hope to see you then.